Everything that surrounds us in everyday life is eventually doomed to end up in a landfill or be recycled. For various reasons, there are many places in the world with various abandoned equipment. In this issue, we will look at places that have become cemeteries for various equipment. Chatillon Car Cemetery. In the south of Belgium, near a small town called Chatillon, hundreds of old cars are rotting right in the middle of the forest. Even today, no one undertakes to say with absolute certainty why and for what purpose these cars were assembled here, why they were left to rot. But there are two most popular versions of the origin of this cemetery, and apparently one of them is true. According to one version, these cars once belonged to US soldiers who were stationed in this region. It is not known how they received these cars in the middle of the war, but many had personal cars. When World War II ended, all military personnel returned to the United States, but transporting vehicles was too expensive. The officers decided to leave all the American cars in Belgium. The cars were placed tightly on the hill, hiding them from prying eyes, with the expectation of future transportation to the States. Upon returning home, the soldiers were asked to independently cover the costs necessary for transporting the cars, but none of them agreed, since the delivery amount was more expensive than the car itself. According to another less logical version, all the cars in this forest were collectible or rare, and some supposedly wealthy collectors decided in this way to protect the cars in the forest during the war so that they would not be stolen or dismantled. But at the end of the war, something prevented these cars from being taken from the forest. Initially, there were 4 cemeteries in Chatillon, which housed 500 cars. Now there is only one thing left. Over a long period of time, due to corrosion and rot, most of the cars simply fell apart, and what remained was dismantled by the local population and car collectors. Car dump at the diamond mines in Oranjemund. This is such a city in Namibia, not a dirty word. This is a small town that is wholly owned by Namdeb, a joint state-owned enterprise between Namibia and the De Beers Diamond Corporation. In the area of the town, which is located near the mouth of the Orange River, there are huge deposits of diamonds, and, in fact, the entire city was built to accommodate miners. This area is virtually impossible to enter, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Any unauthorized possession of diamonds carries a prison sentence of up to 15 years. But Oranjemund is also known as the location of one of the world's largest car dumps. Once the car entered the city, it never left it again. Apparently, this was done to prevent the illegal export of diamonds. Some of the rusting cars date back to 1920. The cemetery even contains World War II tanks that were previously used to level sand dunes. USSR Submarine Cemetery on the Kola Peninsula. In a bay called Nezametnaya, which is located in the Arctic, long-dead submarines are slowly decomposing, a sad sight, because for a huge number of sailors they were home for many months and even years, and now they are just piles of scrap metal and the memory of brave sailors. This bay is located inside the border zone, so access there is possible only to those who have local registration or passes, but there are illegal cross-country trails from the nearby cities of Gadzivo and Snezhnogorsk. Around the end of the 70s, Nezametnaya Bay began to be used as a cemetery for ships and submarines, some of which were nuclear. Shipyards in those days had great difficulty coping with the repair of current and emergency orders, so, as a rule, they were not even assigned the task of dismantling old submarines. And the problem of disposal was solved quite simply, if not shooting as a target during exercises, then towing to a remote bay, where the hull of the boat soon lay down on the ground itself. According to the stories of sailors, in the 80s some boats and ships were still afloat there. Then they decided to dismantle them for metal, since rust from the hulls and the remains of technical fluids clogged the water area. Some of the hulls were winched ashore and left to rot on the shore. Railway Scrapyard in Bury, UK. In 1955, the nationalised British Railways announced plans to scrap most of its fleet. The recently decommissioned equipment included approximately 650,000 carriages and 16,000 locomotives. British Railways were unable to cope with the volumes, and many of the trains were sold to private scrapyards. Among these was the Woodham Brothers landfill in Barry, South Wales. At first, the locomotives were cut up and scrapped immediately, but by the fall of 1965, Scrapyard owner Di Woodham decided to focus on the easier work of salvaging the cars. The rusting locomotives were left on the street, where they soon became a popular city landmark. Enthusiasts soon realized that the Woodham brothers offered an excellent opportunity to acquire rare locomotives for the surviving lines that were beginning to open throughout the country. Many of the models in the junkyard were impossible to find anywhere else. In September 1968, the first salvaged locomotive left the scrapyard, and the rate of locomotive rescues only increased in the 70s. In the end, much to the surprise of the scrapyard owner, 213 locomotives were removed. The latter left Barry in March 2013. Despite this, today this landfill still contains a huge number of carriages and locomotives. Di Woodham, who died in 1994, was very proud of his role in saving steam locomotives for future generations. Today, many of the engines from his yard operate on surviving railway lines throughout the UK. A motorcycle cemetery in upstate New York. If you go looking for this place, do not confuse it with the city of the same name, which is located in the south of this state. There used to be an old warehouse in Lockport, New York, that became a legend among motorcyclists. The warehouse was once owned by a man named Call, who owned several motorcycle dealerships. Buying cheap Japanese motorcycles, as well as various broken ones, he very soon accumulated a huge number of vehicles. In the 1970s, Call bought a special room to store his huge collection, and in 1997 he sold it along with the motorcycles stored there. The buyer, whose name was Frank, was going to use the warehouse to sell motorcycle parts. However, the building fell into disrepair and Frank was unable to recoup the cost of its restoration. Eventually, the warehouse was seized by local authorities, preventing anyone else from seeing the collection. Photos of the cemetery first appeared in April 2010, causing motorcycle enthusiasts to search for the cemetery, and some even managed to buy rare vintage motorcycles and parts for them. Photographer Chris Seward summed it up perfectly when he said, "This is by far one of the most mysterious and strange places I have ever been to." Equipment Cemetery at the bottom of Lake Baikal. Not many people know, but the water area of the picturesque Lake Baikal is a huge cemetery of equipment at the bottom of the lake. Hundreds of cars, snowmobiles, trucks, tractors, and even railway cars and an airplane. All this equipment had accumulated in the depths of the lake over many years, and for a long time there was simply no technical capability to lift it from there. Over the past 15 years, during environmental expeditions, equipment has been retrieved from the depths of the lake, but there is no less of it there every year. Due to safety violations, a large number of vehicles go under the ice. Not only professional rescuers, but also amateur divers take part in cleaning the water area. It all started with training dives into Lake Baikal, during which divers found equipment at the bottom and reported the coordinates to rescuers. Cemetery of streetcars killed by General Motors. By the beginning of the 20th century, almost every locality in the United States with a population of more than 2,500 people had its own system of electric roads. In addition to this, tram lines connected a huge number of cities with each other. The longest continuous route was more than 1,500 kilometers, and the average speed of intercity trains was 130 kilometers per hour. For some time, the tram companies and auto giants managed to coexist and develop normally, but by the 1920s, sales of General Motors cars began to plummet. Those who wanted and could afford a personal car had already purchased one. The remaining 90% traveled mainly by electric vehicles. A 1974 report by U.S. Senate Counsel Bradford Snell provided evidence that from 1936 to 1950, General Motors, along with Firestone Tire, Standard Oil of California, and Phillips Petroleum, created shell holding companies through which they bought up streetcar lines and liquidated them. Direct threats, blackmail, deception, and bribery of officials were used, and extensive connections of the leadership in ruling and banking circles were used. As a result, the trams were gradually replaced by smelly, slow buses. The manufacturer of these buses was the same General Motors. Well, inconvenient schedules, cramped and stuffy interiors forced solvent citizens to purchase personal cars. The court considered only the conspiracy to purchase buses manufactured by General Motors to be proven. For violating antitrust laws, the company was fined $5,000, and each of the company's managers was fined $1. By that time, trams had already disappeared from almost all cities. On April 26, 1986, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which is located 150 kilometers from Kiev, near the city of Pripyat, the explosion of the fourth power unit occurred. The reactor was completely destroyed and a large amount of radioactive substances was released into the environment. The 30-kilometer zone around the nuclear power plant became completely unsuitable for life. Several dozen villages and settlements fell into this zone, which people were forced to leave. This accident was the largest in the history of nuclear energy. Hundreds of pieces of equipment, dump trucks, bulldozers, various Soviet and imported special equipment, military tracked vehicles and helicopters were deployed to eliminate the consequences after completion of the work. All this equipment was collected near the village called Rosoka. Absolutely all the cars, helicopters, and other equipment in Chernobyl were so covered with radioactive particles that their further operation was simply impossible, and they all became exhibits of the famous Chernobyl Equipment Cemetery. Many of the vehicles that emitted radiation the most were buried, for example, the first fire trucks to arrive to extinguish the fire. During the existence of this cemetery of equipment, many cases of looting were recorded, starting from Soviet times. Spare parts, engines, and the most valuable parts disappeared. In the early 90s, a wave of equipment removal from the zone was also recorded then. Mainly engines and radiators that were removed from trucks were exported. Well, throughout the entire time, something constantly disappeared and was sold for scrap. Today, no one can answer for sure where all the equipment went. Apparently time played the main role. Radioactive pieces of iron ended up as scrap metal and melted down in small batches, and over the course of 3 decades the equipment became less and less. Well, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. If it was interesting, support the video with likes. Thank you for subscribing, and take a look at what else we have prepared for you.